Let's begin with this a word from a psalm and a prayer. I gotta find the right psalm now. That's not the right psalm. This is the right psalm.
You just wrote a book on this.
I know.
Which psalms?
Give ear to my words, O Lord. Give heed to my sighing. Listen to the sound of my cry, my God and my King. For to you I pray. O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice, and in the morning I plead my case before you to watch. Amen. All right, I'm Rolf Jacobson. I was here a couple months ago, I think, and then my colleague Dick Nicey was here last month, right? I teach at Lutheran Seminary. I teach Old Testament. So, my understanding is that you have been, in the last month, over more or less, better or worse, more faithful or some, holiday season anxiety, moving from Ruth through Chronicles, right? Roughly? Yeah. Before that, since I was here, you must have gone through like Numbers and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, right? Okay, I'm going to start off with just a couple dates because I think it helps to capture the story. Unless you think, are you so secure and confident in like when things are happening? Would this help? I think it would help. Did I tell you this last time that my first day of seminary, teacher Jim Lindbergh put a bunch of dates on the board? Did I tell you this story? Okay. So I get to first day of seminary, and Jim Lindbergh does this on the board. He taught Old Testament. He was also my godfather. Well, he still is my godfather, come to think of it. Because he puts these dates. He is still alive. He's probably about coming up on 80 this year. Okay, in case you can see, 1280, this is all BC, right? So the numbers get smaller. 1240, 1000, you can see 922, 722, 587, 539, 333. These are the dates just to kind of write in the front of your Bible or to have in your head. And here's what they are. He puts these on and he says, it wasn't quite this crass, but he goes, what are these? You should all know these, You went to he points out, he had another godson in the same class as me. He said, Tostengard, you went to Augustana, you should know these dates. And so, sort of education by shame, which isn't very good. But 1280 is the Exodus, all right? We think that's sort of the best date we can nail down for when the Exodus happens, that you read about in the book of Exodus, right? The plagues, the deliverance at the Red Sea, 40 years in the wilderness. I don't think this date is actually very secure, 1240, because they use, but it's a nice round number. When they use the number 40 in the Bible, it doesn't necessarily mean 40. It's sort of, it's a round number for a pretty big number, okay? And 3 is a round number for a small number. So like my dad always exaggerates. When my dad says 14, that's really big. Like he says, oh, we had an expensive dinner last night, your mother and I. It was 14 prices. That's what he says. Well, that's how 40 works, okay? It doesn't necessarily mean 40, but it might. The reason they pick it is it's about a life. It's about the lifespan of a person in those eras, all right? 1000 is a very secure date. That's when King David moves the ark to Jerusalem. Up until that point, Jerusalem had not been an Israelite city. In the middle of Israel, as Israel occupies the land, and as they emerge to become a known people in history, Jerusalem was not Israelite. And then it becomes Israelite, and David makes it the capital. David, 922 is the death of Solomon. So you get David and then Solomon. Solomon dies. And then the kingdom splits in half. And you looked at this last month, right? The northern kingdom lasts, for those of us who remember numbers, exactly 200 years, which makes it convenient, right? 722, the northern kingdom is destroyed by Assyria. And the northern kingdom is called Israel. It's often also called Ephraim for its biggest tribe in the Bible. When you read about this, now you read about Ephraim, that means the north. Sometimes it's called Jacob for the ancestor that's most important to the northern tribes, Jacob. And its capital is Samaria. Okay? So many years later, when Jesus is running into Samaritans, those are the descendants of the northern kingdom. But that's for later. But just to know who they are. 722, the southern kingdom, Jerusalem, falls. It's called Judah. Its descendants are called Jews. That's where that name comes, is from the tribe of Judah.
I'm sorry, you said 722 was
I meant,
north.
yeah, the northern kingdom falls in 722 to Assyria. The southern kingdom falls in 587 to Babylon, and then starts the Babylonian exile. The Babylonian exile lasts about 40 years, this period here. And then in 539, Babylon is conquered by Persia, and Cyrus of Persia, they don't even put up a fight. They just say, they throw the gates open and they say, come on in, we submit to you. And then Cyrus comes in and says, all of the captives in Babylon can go home to their home kingdoms. And not all of the Jews do. But some of the Jews go home to Jerusalem. Others of them stay in Babylon. And to this day, now Babylon is like Iran and Iraq, right? And to this day, there has been a small population of Jews in Babylon up until the radical Islam really just took off in the last 50 years. That's essentially, now, the reason I think that's helpful, so what you've done from Ruth is King David's great-grandmother. So you've got Ruth is here, okay? The story of Ruth. And then through 1st and 2nd, right? So Ruth, then you go, hold on, all right? You go all the way through 587. The book of 2 Kings ends in 587. Actually, it ends maybe 14 years later, I think. 570 something, all right? And then you go back with Chronicles, right? And Chronicles is another telling of the story, and it goes back to King David, essentially, right? And you got those long lists of names that I hope you just skipped. Nobody cared. Well, some genealogies in the Bible are important, but not Chronicles. Not to Christians, anyway. There might be some Jews who care. And then Chronicles tells the story all the way. Where are you today? 2 Chronicles 4?
That was yesterday.
Okay. And then what you're going to do then is the books of Ezra and Nehemiah pick up after 539. And they're going to take the story a couple hundred years further with the priest Ezra and the governor Nehemiah. And what's going to happen is the walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt and the temple in Jerusalem is rebuilt and they start worshiping again. Well, they've always worshipped. They continued to worship even during the exile, just on the ruins of the church, the temple. But then Ezra and Nehemiah is going to pick it over. Then what's going to happen, you go in order, right? Then you're going to get the story of Job and Psalms. And for sure have me back then, because that's what I'm better at.
But you're better at this than we are, so.
Well, here's the thing is, I think, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, on the prairies here, right, people would probably only have a few books in their house. And you'd be given a Bible at confirmation. That would then become the family Bible of your family when you grew up, and people would read out of the Bible nightly. And so they sort of the knowledge base was there. But then after Psalms, you're going to go back and you're going to pick up Isaiah. Let me get a different color out. And the different prophets live at different times. Isaiah lives here. Is that true? No, that's not true. Isaiah lives here in 722. And then you get Jeremiah, who lives in 587, and Ezekiel, who's after, and then Daniel during the exile. And then you're going to go back to Amos. So the books are not arranged in narrative order. all right? So where you've been is coming out of the exile, coming into the land with Ruth, and then you've read that whole big long story, one version of it, through the destruction of Jerusalem and the start of the exile, right? Correct? Does that sound familiar? So what I really want to talk about is, what is that story with you today? I mean, what's up with that? But one more little bit. Can you stand one more bit of context? Okay. I think this is really interesting to me, and I've only started to wrap my mind about this very recently. So in 722, the northern kingdom, which is the northern sort of 10 and a half tribes, okay? They are defeated. And their leaders, their city, their capital Samaria is destroyed, and their leaders, they go into exile over here, right? If this is, let's say, if this whole thing is the Mediterranean Sea and Israel is right here, Assyria is next to Babylon. It's also over in Iraq, in Iran. They take the leaders of Samaria and they put them into exile, and they disappear into the mists of history. That's a phrase I learned from Pastor Paul Harris here. They lose their social cohesion. They are not exterminated in a genocide, but they dissolve, and they take on the identity of wherever they are sent, except for the ones who stay there, who are called Samaritans. Okay? So 150 years later, the same thing happens to the southern kingdom. The leaders of Jerusalem, in two deportations, first in 597 and second in 587, the leaders are all taken over here to Babylon. And they think what's going to happen to them is what happened to the northern kingdoms, who we call, right, the lost tribes of Israel. And it doesn't. The Jews are still here today, right? They're still here in the world. They're still here in America. You probably listen to some on the radio today if you were listening to the Sports Center or ESPN Radio or the NPR, right? I know some of the characters on those shows are Jewish. They're still here today. Why are they still here when their compatriots in the northern tribes disappeared? And here's what I want to propose to you. They are here because in exile, in these years between 587 and 539, when they're in exile, they decided to engage in a radical act of resistance against the empire. And that was to preserve and tell their own story on their own terms, based on their own faith in God. So what you just read the last month is their act of resistance against the empire, their story. In exile, turn if you would to the end of 2 Kings. If you have a Lutheran study Bible, it is on page 637 in the Lutheran study Bible. And as I always like to say, if you don't have a Lutheran study Bible, it's still on page 637 in the Lutheran study Bible. 2 Kings 25, starting at verse 27. Someone read. Just flip back. If you look in chapter 24, Judah is overrun by enemies. Its king, its second to last king, called Jehoiakim with an N, he is captured and taken to Babylon. Jerusalem is destroyed, and then they describe in detail all the stuff they take away from the temple. They take the bronze and they take the silver, and then they take the they take all the people. And then, starting in verse 27, someone please read. Go ahead.
In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the year Marduk became king of Babylon, he released Joachim, king of Judah, from prison. He did this on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Joachim put aside his prison clothes and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day the kings gave Joachim a regular allowance as long as he lived.
Yeah, so Jehoiakim was taken in the first deportation in 597, right? 37th year it says, right? So in 560, he is released. And we actually have, in the Babylonian, we've got the sort of the receipts of the kingdom. And there's a receipt saying that so many jars of oil are to be given to the king of Judah in exile. This is, the Babylonian tax officials wrote this down. So we have extra biblical confirmation that in exile, Jehoiakim is given a place of honor. That's how the story ends, right? So that's how we know this story is written in exile. And what they do is they go back and the books, scholars have, based on how these books are arranged in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, that the Jews, their order, what you have is you have Deuteronomy, then you have Joshua, then you have Judges, not Ruth. I'll explain that in a minute. Then you have Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings. No, that's not right. Samuel, right? Samuel and then Kings. And these books are the story that was an act of resistance to the empire that the people pulled together because of kind of forensic investigation of the writing style and other reasons. We know that this was the unit. Okay. The book of Ruth was later added. It was written separately, and it was added at its place in the story, right? Between Judges and Samuel. But it was a later composition. I want to talk a little bit about that great composition. So, I just want you to think about that for a minute, is how, as a people, it's knowing our story that keeps us together. And then being able to practice our story in faith practices keeps us together. It's what gives us our identity. It grounds us in God. It gives us our social cohesion as the people of God. Does that make sense? How do you preserve, I just kind of want to hear examples from you. How do you preserve the story of your family or your tradition in your own homes? Doesn't have to be a Christian story, just, of who you are.
We sing the table grace.
Yeah.
People from generations in my family have, and every time a new friend comes over to the house, they're like, "What are you doing?" But it's part of our identity as a family.
To have a practice, right, that embodies the story and values. Is the question too vague? Let's talk about, as the church, how we right now, we've just come through, we're in the middle of the time as the church when we tell the story of Jesus every year from the start of Advent through Easter, right? And that story, the story of the promise of the Savior, the arrival of the Savior born of a virgin, then the early ministry of the Savior, which is the season of Epiphany, which starts today, right? Epiphany starts today. 12 days of Christmas, right? The last day is January 5th. January 6th today, it's my cousin Kari's birthday, but more importantly, it's the Epiphany, the day that we celebrate the wise men arriving with their gifts. And then the season of Epiphany is about the first half of the public life of Jesus, right? about the miracles and teachings and controversies where he reveals himself as the Son of God. And then Lent is about the second half, about his passion, meaning his death, crucifixion, and resurrection, right? So we tell that every day. And what are the meaningful rituals to you that you do either here at church or that you do in your homes around that story? Just give me one. Oh, yeah, a Lenten calendar. What do you do? What's it look like in your house?
It has candy.
Yeah. But is it, do you buy the one from Germany with the little cardboard doors?
We have them.
Or do you have the wooden one from Williams-Sonoma?
We have the German card.
Yeah. We didn't get it out this year, but we have the wooden one. That's always wrong because it only has 25 days, but you know, we make it work. What other things? That's a great way of an example.
The 4 candles.
The 4 candles, you light them at home.
We have the nativity set and the wise men move around the house. It's like
Yeah.
backwards Elf on the Shelf, you know. Where
Yeah.
It's like the kids are looking for them throughout the house, and then they finally make their way today.
And they arrive today. Yeah, I know some people that do that with, you know, at first they put out just the barn with the animals. No people, nope, right, during Advent. And then Mary and Joseph get closer, right, and so on. Some other examples of ways we embody the story in tradition that are practices that are meaningful to you.
Singing the songs.
Yeah. And for you, are there songs that go with particular days of the year? What are some of those?
Well, at Christmas, of course, they have Christmas songs, and then
Yep.
at Easter, you have the Easter song, Hallelujah, and, you know, in the spring, some of the songs, like the Earth and All Stars, and, you know,
Yeah.
it depends on what the season is.
I'll tell you a couple of my favorite. As far as I'm concerned, you cannot have Easter without Jesus Christ is risen today. You cannot have Reformation Sunday, the last Sunday of October, without a mighty fortress. And you
We
can't.
accidentally did that 2 years ago. We found out we can't.
Yeah, well, it's good to know, right? And
We did that.
now my church had a hymn. The hymn picker didn't like the next one, so. But for me, you cannot have All Saints Day without For All the Saints, in which I always cry during my favorite teacher who died. His favorite hymn, his favorite verse was, "And when the strife is fierce, the warfare long, steals on the ear the distant triumph song, then hearts are brave again and arms are strong." Hallelujah, right? I mean, and I just, when I sit in chapel, I turn to Andy Root and I say, I'm going to cry during the 5th stanza, just ignore me. Right? There's nothing going on. It's just I do it every year. But so, I mean, that becomes part of the tradition for me, that I know I'm going to cry when I think about, especially Don and other people I've lost. So one of the things I want you to think about what you're doing in this course, as you get together to read the story, is you are engaging in an act, you're joining in the act of resistance, of claiming God's story and parts of it that you might not know, the parts of the Old Testament. And I want to go back, and each of the individual stories that are saved are important stories with multiple meanings that speak again and again. And so, you know, when they collected the various stories, we know that they had a lot more stories that they could have included. As you read through Kings this month, did you, for instance, go to 2 Kings, trying to find a good place that gives an example. Of course, I can't find it. hold on. So go to 2 Kings 13. I think this will work. Yes, this will work. 2 Kings 13, go to verse 10. What they have what we call in Old Testament studies regnal formulas. They have a king of the north and a king in the south, right? And they date the start of the kings based on the other one's regnal date, right? So Joash is the southern kingdom in Jerusalem at the same time as Jehoash begins to reign in the north. So someone read starting at verse 10 and I will interrupt.
In the 37th year of King Joash of Judah, Jehoash began to reign over Israel and Samaria. He reigned 16 years. He also did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from the sins of
Jeroboam, son of Nebat.
Which he caused Israel to sin, but he walked in them. Now the rest of the acts of Joash, and all that he did, as well as the might with which he fought against King
Amaziah
of Judah, were not written in the books of annals of the kings of Israel.
Actually it says, are they not written?
Are they not written, yes, in the annals of the kings of Israel?
So it talks about this book. I remember being in high school and reading it. Did you have the same thing? I'm reading it and they go, the rest of the acts of Joash, they end most, are they not written in the annals of the kings of Israel? And if it's a king of Judah and they say, and the rest of the acts of King Jehoahaz, are they not written in the annals of the kings of Judah? And early on they talk about the scroll of the wars of the Lord and a couple other ancient scrolls. And then I went to the table of contents and I tried to find the annals of the kings of Judah. And I discovered they're not in there because they were lost, right? So they selectively picked some of the stories, the ones that they had room for. And the rest of the stories were contained in other scrolls that, who knows, maybe they were destroyed or somebody spilled coffee on them and the ink all bled and they only had one copy, right? But they're lost. So a couple things. First of all, the overall story has a meaning for our lives. And then the individual stories were chosen for their individual power. And they don't mean one thing, right? They have multiple meanings, or that's not the correct term. The correct term is they have a surplus of meaning. That is, you might see something in it that's somewhat the same but different than I see in it. The texts or stories are meant to work that way. And I want to talk with you about two stories in particular. But first of all, about the overall story. What was your impression of the overall story from entering the promised land, right? You went through Joshua and Judges last week, and then this week Ruth, Samuel, and Kings, and I won't get into Chronicles, because you just started. Take a moment and just in groups of 2 or 3, say one thing that surprised you, or one thing that you have a question about, or one thing that really had a deep impact on you. Just take a minute and come up with something, okay? I have someone's coffee cup from the Mall of America. Oh, she said it was a band cup. Huh? I just bought Christmas Tico coffee.
Israel and Judah.
Well, they're bad. I just saw them here. They did it the first time.
And then
Right. The elders are all even so. I see it. She said she or her husband
Great.
just so she used to have it quick hair. So with liquid in it, throw in her purse.
All these ones. Yeah. And then down here, and then Eliza lived here, and then all of a sudden, you know, then they got some more buildings when they gave us directions, and then some more years.
It was a pretty big,
Well, a lot. That was incredible. But after being here, after all these, and why are people doing it? You know, you got the whole, everybody all together again.
It's interesting.
Yeah, and he ruled for, and he ruled for 7 years. And then there was 3 months last year. And 11 years, but the one. That was Judah. After a while, it was just all Judah. And then, this last one here, was just Josiah. That's the last I mean, after a while,
I was hoping
all right. So, comments, questions, surprises?
I just want to know where all this stuff is.
What?
I just want to know where all this stuff is. All this gold, all these big temples, all these things they built in wood, they're not there.
Yeah.
there was a History Channel show last
Yeah.
about Solomon and about David and finding their stuff, which we haven't.
Well, the Babylonians took it.
Yeah.
I mean, right? They used it for what empires use stuff for. We think we found one piece from the temple, maybe, because it's kind of written in Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, and it says it's a plate and it's half broken, and it says from the temple of, and that's the part that's missing, right? But it looks like Hebrew. But yeah, I mean, right? It describes part of the deep sadness of the end of the Book of Kings is the destruction of the temple. And but then the hope that the king is released in exile, and so it ends with this just the possibility of a future. And because we're still here, because we're here, we know that future happened. They didn't know when they wrote, when they collected the stories and put them together into a history that we call the Deuteronomistic history, meaning Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. When you said the stuff, also the places and things like that?
You know, they talk about David assembling billions of chariots and horses and all this stuff. I was like, one or two of these got to turn up somewhere. But, you know,
Yeah.
I just don't see why. It's easier for me to believe that Jesus rose than this stuff happened, because they talk about physical stuff.
Yeah.
It's just,
Well, the question, I mean, one of the main questions about the horses and the chariots is they are not looked upon positively. I mean, they are seen the story is very negative about Solomon, right? And his horses and chariots. because in ancient Israel, the only use for horses was military. They didn't use horses for, I think I told this 2 months ago, they didn't use horses for agriculture. They used oxen and donkeys, right? Horses were for wars. And so that's why the Old Testament seems to have a dim view of horses, right? You know, do not put your trust in horses, it says. Trust in God.
Is that why they would always hamstring the horses? They'd say that. I'm like, why are they doing that to the horses?
Well, they're doing it so that they didn't kill the horse, but that the horse couldn't be
Used for war.
used for war.
There's a, and I was talking to my boss about this at work today, and he said that there's something that's gonna happen at the theater, a bunch of theaters on January 19th. It's something like, it's called like Points of Evidence, which some local guy did a documentary on proving that all these things that you're talking about for Exodus, for the
Sure.
and I don't know, there's a website that you can go to, but it's on January 19th, and maybe there's some of those kind of things that are in that.
Yeah, I mean, we here. Two things. First of all, I mean, I think there's enough evidence in the historical record to sort of document the main lines of the story. Like I said, we've got. I mean, it's amazing that we've got this receipt from some tax official during the Babylonian exile talking about the many casks of oil being allotted to the Jewish king. I mean, that's really odd that we still have that. But I don't want you to focus on the historical question. Not because I think it's just not worth very much. I think since the Enlightenment, what we turned faith into is the intellect saying, yes, I believe that. Rather than faith being the heart entertaining, who is the God that is meeting me in this story? So for instance, I want to invite you in a minute to read with me one of the stories you read about Elijah ascending into heaven on the chariot and his mantle falling to Elisha, all right? Now, what I really want you to ask is, why did this story was one of the ones they thought was worth preserving. And what's the spiritual impact of that story on you? Whether or not you want to say, yeah, I mean, I shouldn't have picked that story but I did already. Because it's coming up in church in a few weeks for churches that use Revised Common Lectionary, which we don't here, right? That's all right. So part of what I want you to get out of this is, how do you read a biblical story for spiritual outcomes rather than just for, yes, I believe that happened? Not that it's bad to know what you believe happened. But for instance, I'm easy to get off track, and my students learn to do it on purpose because it's funny for them. And I try to notice it and say, you just got me off track. That was really well done. So I don't know, from American history, are you aware that after the Civil War, when Ulysses Grant became president, he integrated the Army and the public service, blacks and whites working together. And then Woodrow Wilson segregated the government workforce, the Army and the public service. Right, so that's a historical question, right? It's not very important to me whether you believe that that's true, but really, what does that mean about our country? And what does that mean about who Grant was and Wilson was? Because I don't know if you ever noticed that the historians, when I was a kid, Grant was always listed as the #2 worst president. Because I was a kid before Nixon, right? Then later he was the 3rd worst president, with Nixon and the first Johnson being the other 2 really bad ones, right? And Wilson was always in the top 10. But lately, that's been that's been more complicated as people have remembered that Grant actually integrated the government and then Woodrow resegregated it. What is that? So I bring that up as an example of, let's talk about what the story means for us instead of whether I believe it's true. By the way, does anybody want to correct me? Was I wrong about that fact or those facts? Or
The grant and those facts?
yeah, as far as I know, that's true.
Do you want me to ask the Google machine?
No.
Grant had a big problem, so they-
Yeah, well, let's not talk about Grant and the Native Americans. You're right. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
You were talking about spiritual.
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to get back. Let's. So here's. I want to light down with you. What do you think the meaning of the whole story that you've just read for the community of faith is? So the story starts, right, with Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law. Then Joshua, the people enter into the land. Then Judges, right? And I don't know how much did you talk about Judges? Much last month?
Did anybody watch the video recently? Not remembering.
So, about 10 years ago, my cousin's wife, I know, this is going somewhere. She is in her book group at Pilgrim Congregational Church in Minneapolis. In her book group, they decided to read the story of Samson and Delilah. Right? Do you remember the story? Samson's a judge. He defeats people. He's got the hair. It's the secret of his strength. He marries the foreign temptress. She gets her secret out of him, cuts his hair. He ends up, right, bringing down the house. She reads this and she calls me and she goes, "What in the world is this story?" And I didn't know what to say to her because I do Psalms. I didn't have an answer for her. But then you get the rest of the book of Judges, right? Do you remember some of the stories? Things get worse and worse and worse in the book of Judges, right? Starts out pretty good. Deborah's in charge. Then you get Samson and Delilah. Then you get Melchizedek who wants to be king. And then you get Jephthah's daughter. He swears a rash oath and he thinks he has to keep it, so he kills his daughter. And then at the end you get the Levite's concubine, right? I think for me, I didn't know what to say to my cousin's wife because I hadn't thought about it ever, what the book of Judges was. My experience with the book of Judges was the golden book still that I had from when I was 5 years old. Did any of you guys have golden books that told biblical stories? And that was a great story. Samson, right? I think what you have to undo in your mind, and I hadn't undone it 10 years ago, even though I was already, professor and stuff. The book of Judges is not a story of role models. Not every Israelite in the Old Testament is a positive role model. Once you can let that go, and I knew that about other characters, the book of Judges is a picture of what life in the people of God is like when everybody does what they want. Right? Towards the end of the book of Judges, it says 3 or 4 times, in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everybody did what he wanted. And so it's a commentary on human nature in an anarchy, right? If the form of government is anarchy, and everybody does what he or she wishes, this is what happens. I should call up Claire and tell her, hey, remember that question you asked me 10 years ago? I've thought about it for 10 years. And Does that kind of help a little bit though about what's going on with the book of Judges? It's a commentary on the human soul.
But, you know, when you're talking about, and I kind of wondered about that anyway with everybody did what they wanted. So then they finally got a king and God was saying, well, you know, you don't want a king.
Exactly.
They're horrible to you. So, and it was true, you know, half of the kings, or more than half, were rotten. But basically, it still seemed like they were doing what they wanted. So to me, I'm looking at this going, okay, to me what this is saying, that that you are looking to the wrong thing for guidance. So yeah, they're not positive role models, but they are role models. They're role models of what happens when you aren't following God instead of just following whatever you're doing.
So turn to Joshua 24. I know you didn't read that this month. I'm going to pick up just on what you said. I like what you said.
She needs to go to seminary.
Well, I don't know. We can wreck people pretty well.
That's true. That's a good plan.
All right, Joshua 24. So come back with me to this little story here. And it's worth doing because you're going to be going back over parts of this story again in the next months, especially as you read through the prophets. It's really good to go through the story 3 times. First, you're reading it in Kings and Samuel. Then you're going to read it in Chronicles. Then you're going to come back at different prophets and drop into the story. And it's sort of like, oh, the 3rd time through, I kind of get it, right? And so kind of reading through in what we call canonical order rather than narrative order is okay. All right, so the Deuteronomic history. It starts off with the law. This is how God wants us to live. All right? And we summarize it in 10 ways. Worship God. Don't misuse God's name. Keep the Sabbath. Take care of the elderly. Don't kill. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't use your words to hurt others. And don't covet other people's stuff. And then, love the Lord your God with all your heart. So that's it. That's how God wants you to live. Then comes Joshua. And the people take possession of the land. Now go at the end of Joshua's life, he huddles up the people. And he says, I'm about to die. And he gives a speech that looks backwards and forwards. And then he says this. Verse 15. 24:15. He has a long speech. It's not as long as Moses. Moses' speech is all the book of Deuteronomy. Joshua gets chapters 23 and 24. All right. Someone read starting at verse 15.
Now if you are unwilling to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites of those lands you are living at. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord.
All right, so he puts in front of the people a choice at the end of his life. Choose who you serve. The gods your ancestors used to worship, or the God of the Amorites, right, whose land we live in, or the Lord. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord, right? And that's a famous plaque. I think I talked about that a few months ago, right? Talk about that a little bit? No, we weren't this far yet. All right?
Well, you sort of did, though. Okay.
As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Let's keep going.
Then the people answered, Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve the gods, for it is the Lord our God who brought us and our ancestors up from the land of Egypt.
Okay, so now skip to verse 19.
But Joshua said to the people, You cannot serve the Lord, for he is a holy God.
Right. So, I love this. Choose whom you will serve. It's sort of like standing in front of confirmation students who are 14. Are you ready to confirm your faith? I believe, right? They're not ready, but neither are you. Choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve. Okay, we will choose the Lord. You can't! Now, that's an odd teaching choice, right? But that's how Joshua ends. We will serve the Lord. You can't do it. invite you to think about the history that you then just read as commentary on that truth. So first we had the book of Judges. When the people are organized according to each household, having their father and mother, and every household does what they want. In those days there was no king and everyone did what he wanted. How did the people do? Did they serve the Lord? And the answer in the book of Judges is, not very well. So then they said, all right, we want to have a king. And God says through the prophet Samuel, you don't really want a king. Because here's what kings are good for, right? This is like, I think, 1 Samuel 9 or 10. Kings will tax you until you have nothing left. And they will take your daughters to be members of their harem, and bakers and weavers, and they will take your sons to be builders and soldiers. And they will take your animals and your grain and your olives and your grapes and your herd for their parties. That's just what we want, the people say. And then the next, what, from 1,000 down to 5 years, so the next almost, 400 plus years are Samuel and Kings. And it's a commentary on this again. We will serve the Lord. You can't do it. You can't do it if each of you is your own Lord. And you can't do it if you have a king in charge. And I liked what you said. I don't know your name. You said, because the problem is, then you just had each king doing what he wanted. Right? And when the king wanted to do good, it held together a little better, right? But when the kings didn't want to do good and they started wars and they committed child sacrifice and other things, it didn't go very well. So then the book ends in exile. And it ends in exile with the king being released. And I think it has at least two meanings. I want to propose to you two meanings, but then I want you to propose your own meanings. One meaning is it says, you know, it's really true we can't serve God. We can't serve the Lord. But the Lord remains committed to us. You may just caught my what's on the wheelchair. The book of 2 Kings ends with the hope that the Lord will create a future out of the ashes that the human beings have turned God's people into. That God's persistent commitment to Israel will create a future. So it's interesting, by the way, what you're going to get to next is you're going to read about how the people organized themselves after the exile. We've tried every man as his own Lord. That didn't work. Then we tried kings. Worked a little better, but in the end, its failure was even greater. Now we're going to try to be led by priests. Israel becomes a province of first the Persian Empire, and then it ends up being a province of some other empires, eventually the Greek Empire, and then eventually the Roman Empire, and they're run by priests. It's what we call a hierocracy, right? Just see how that works out. I'll give you a hint. It ends on a hill on a Friday afternoon outside Jerusalem. And then the question is, what's God's commitment to the people going to look like then? Story continues. So that's one. So those are the two themes. One is, we can't do it. And the story is a commentary on our inability to follow God. And it's a commentary on God's persistence in staying committed to the people. What other, that's just where I am today. I might not think that in a year. What other kind of big meanings have you posited?
I don't know if it's big, and I'm not sure it's not redundant, but these folks were so very human, and it's not a far reach to look in a mirror and say, do all that well myself, you know, if you kind of, and I sure as heck wouldn't have done all that well with that Deuteronomy list of things you have to do.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
You mean just the 10
No,
Commandments?
those are bad enough, but I'm talking about.
Well,
the
just stick with the 10 Commandments, you know? And loving God and loving neighbor. This is on tape, so I won't say what I was going to say. So, other big themes?
You want me to pause it?
No.
Save the tape.
Well, I mean, Facebook, somebody has a Facebook site for God, right? I'm sure there's a few of them. And one last week said basically, I'm paraphrasing it slightly, God really has just one commandment. Don't be a jerk. Didn't really use the word jerk, right? But don't be a jerk. That's what it comes down to. Love God, love neighbor. And we can't do it. But God remains committed and persistent in his commitment to the people. Other big themes that you gathered? Yep.
Well, this is maybe a little redundant, but it seems like it just kept repeating itself. You know, people go off the
Yeah.
track or whatever, and so it seems like they're just trying to show that, you know, everybody sins, but God always keeps coming back, and it may not give you personally a second chance, but it's giving your descendants and your next generation another chance.
Yeah, and think about being stuck in exile and how the gathering of the story and this, what I keep calling it an act of resistance to the empire, how this story is really paying fundamental witness to the faithfulness of God in the midst of our inability to be faithful in return.
I had a question on, it seems like First Kings, it goes temple, and then it goes down again. I'm just trying to figure out what is the purpose of the temple. I mean, it seems like it's just kind of like, King David, everybody's excited, Solomon finally builds it, and everything's good. And that's not. And I don't understand why it feels like it's like this pyramid pinnacle going up a hill.
Boy, I just want to admit I have not thought deeply enough about that. But you could make the case that the key character in the story that you just read is the temple. And then when you get to the Gospel of Mark, which is our gospel for this year in the church, the key character in the book of Mark is the temple. I mean, not Jesus is, but you know what I mean? And so you get here, in 1000, David moves the Ark of the Covenant, in which are the 10 Commandments written in God's hand. He moves it to Jerusalem. His son Solomon builds the temple, and that temple persists, but it comes into the story at key places. And in 587, the temple is destroyed. Then they start to rebuild it, and they eventually rebuild it, and that's what we call the Second Temple, which is the temple that is there when Jesus is around. And then Jesus says, I'll destroy that temple. Does he say I'll destroy it? He says it will be destroyed and rebuilt. Yeah. It will be destroyed and rebuilt in 3 days, right? And I mean, so I haven't thought, that's a great,
It seems like it's a thing. It's not so much the people. It's this house.
yeah.
God in it, and then does God go away? Is he still in the temple, or when it's disassembled, is he?
Well, I can tell.
Dissipate and then
Well,
I know I'm thinking physically and then.
But I love what you're doing. What you're doing is you're thinking metaphorically along the lines they would have. They know God's not in the temple.
Yeah.
But they also believe God has promised to be particularly present there. What happens when it's destroyed and then we are hauled 500 miles away from here? That's the big question of the exile. And the best answers to that question are in Isaiah chapters 40 through 66, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all right? And I kind of want to keep some of the powder dry, but that's exactly right. Here's where it ends up. It ends up where Paul says, I don't want to get this wrong. If the temple is the place where God has promised to be particularly available, right? What happens after the temple is destroyed? And it's destroyed again for good in about the year 70 AD by the Romans, and it was never rebuilt, right? And there's some crazies around the world that want to rebuild it still today, and we don't want them to do that, because it will just cause World War III, right? Because the Temple Mount is now where the Muslim Dome of the Rock is, the third holiest site in Islam. And so for Israel to get some bulldozers up and knock that down and rebuild the temple, not a good idea, I think. I'm okay if you disagree with that.
I think the temple is important to the people because all the other religions around them, they had something physical to worship, you know, a calf or something like that. And the Israelites were not supposed to worship any graven image.
Sure,
So,
right.
yeah, so the temple is, it's not an image, but it's a place that we can say, this is where our God is.
Right, but so then, I agree. But then the question is, after the destruction of the first temple, what happens to the promised availability of the presence of God?
But
And-
it wasn't there before.
Hold on.
I mean, there wasn't a temple there before.
The Gospel of John says this, John 1:14. The Word became flesh and blood, and literally in Greek it says tabernacled among us. Jesus' body becomes the temple. And that's what he says. The temple will be destroyed and rebuilt in 3 days. And then, after Pentecost, each of us is the temple of the Holy Spirit. So here's what Paul says. This is 1 Corinthians 3:16. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. For God's temple is holy, and you are holy. And so the Spirit of God is now in each of us. You are God's temple. And so then Paul says things like, so don't join your body to impurity. And he means that in many different ways, right? Because the Holy Spirit is in you, so don't join God's Spirit to that which is impure, he urges the people. But I think that's the track. I mean, that's the trajectory. Thank you. I heard her going Trump. Trajectory.
I have a question about the Levites. They had such a big responsibility. Did they become the priests later on too?
Yes.
Okay. But it's like, did they fall in their responsibility too? Because
Yeah.
it was years later that one king, all of a sudden they found the book of law. Okay, we should be doing this. And well, where was it all those other hundreds of years?
Well, that's right. See, this is the temple as a character. In about the year 620, maybe 628, we get a good king. And he comes along and he says, here's some money, fix up the temple. It had fallen into disrepair. And then they go, hey, we found this book, this scroll, which we think is the book of Deuteronomy. That's what they found.
Okay.
And this is in 2 Kings 22 or something like that, right? And he says, hey, we found this book. I think the priests were hiding it from the bad kings that preceded. I don't think the priests were. I think they say, hey, we found this, but it meant, we've been hiding this because your father and grandfather were such evil rulers. They committed child sacrifice, and they were all sorts of other things. You can read about them on your own again. Manasseh and his son, and then Josiah is Manasseh's grandson, and he fixes up the temple. I think that's probably what happened, although you can't know, right? But the priests, people like us, get up really bad going over in the books of Isaiah and Amos and Hosea and Jeremiah. So the failing of the priests, the tribes of Levi, right? Right? The land is divided up. 11 tribes are given land. And the tribe of Levi has no land. They are scattered like yeast across the people. And they are the priestly tribe. And they would live then there would be a priest living probably in every village, doing the priestly work. And they had some cities that were theirs too, but I'm not sure how historically. Just because it says they were given them doesn't mean somebody didn't take them from them right away. What time are you? It's already 8:10. I know some of you have to leave. How late do the rest of you go? 8:30. All right. Can we look at just one story together? I'm proposing we look at 2 Kings 2, but is there a story you'd like to look at more?
I have a question before we
Yeah.
look at the stories.
Okay.
Talking of the temple, David wanted to build God a temple, and he said, no, you've got blood on your hands.
Right.
But wasn't God the one that said, go forth and conquer these lands and these people, I will be behind you and make you successful. And then he got mad at David when he went out and did a census.
Yeah.
But yet God told Solomon, yeah, go do another census now. So it's a little contradictory.
for one and not okay for
Yeah.
the other.
Well, God told Solomon to do it, he didn't tell David to do it.
Yeah, but it's like David showed initiative, don't we reward that?
It says, yes. A line some people think is in the Bible but isn't is God helps those who help themselves, right? One of the things I really respect about this history, the Deuteromistic history, one of the things I respect about it is they preserve contradictory, or at least paradoxically in tension with each other stories. They do not expunge the record, okay? And so you're right. I mean, on the one hand, David seems to be the hero of the story, right? You are not like David. You're a bad king. Or so-and-so died, he wasn't like David. He did evil, right? But on the other hand, you look at David, and David is the anti-Jesus of the Old Testament. David is the human being mentioned most often in the Old Testament. More, what should we say, ink is given to his story than to anybody else in the Old Testament, any human. And Harry Wendt, who wrote the Crossways Bible Study, he lives down here in this area, or like maybe in Burnsville or something. He has come to the conclusion, he's spent his whole life teaching the biblical story. He has come to the conclusion that David is the anti-Jesus. Jesus is the Messiah that David was supposed to be, right? The servant king, the one who comes to serve and sacrifice himself. David was supposed to be like that, but instead David took what he wanted. I'm not sure I fully can go there with Harry, but I think it's a provocative analysis, interpretation. It's a possibility to think of that David is the whole Bathsheba Uriah story, right?
David was human.
Yeah, but particularly good at misusing his power. Yep.
Well, it seems like, to me, the difference between the two, the censuses
Yep.
that Solomon and David took was, David did it for vanity reasons. He wanted to see how many people he had, how much gold and everything, whereas Solomon did it to find out if they were ready to take the next step, and he was instructed to do that.
that, I'm just open to the possibility that it's not all knowable. Do you know what I mean? That is, there's some,
An ulterior motive. to-
or, I mean, some of it doesn't make sense always, and our desire to make things make sense sometimes forces things into, it forces round pegs into square holes sometimes, square pegs into round holes. I can't do that, not, I mean, yeah.
And even Solomon, at the end, you know, did evil in the sight of the Lord.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there wasn't very any of the leaders that actually made it to death without having done any evil in the sight of the Lord.
Well, yeah, and again, that's part of the meaning of the text. Other particular passages you wanted to highlight or wonder about? Turn to 2 Kings 2.
I wonder if their temple made that noise right after they built it.
That one?
Yeah, it's really bugging me. Yeah, well, it should not be built that way.
Well, these are organic materials, right?
I think
They
it's so
sh-
windy.
Huh?
It's so windy.
And they shrink when it gets really cold, does it? I have
It was
this.
making this noise back in.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no.
I was,
That is not okay.
That's heating noise.
It's a brand new room. Sorry,
That's heater.
I digress.
Spiritual
It's still not okay.
Well,
So
you
anyway,
could
just,
do
you know, back to
something
the whole
about it.
temple thing.
It's a vent.
I know some heater guys.
Yeah, it's something. What story are we looking at?
This is the story of Elijah's ascent into heaven. And this is coming up, and I was studying it actually earlier this morning, and so it occurred to me, it just might be a fun story. It's coming up in a few weeks on Transfiguration Sunday, so the gospel reading is Jesus is lit up like the Vegas Strip, right? Peter goes, "This is awesome," right? And then, so to accompany that, you get this story about Elijah, because Elijah's there with him. And it was interesting, my compatriots in this study were like, but you know, before we push record and we broadcast this podcast, that we kind of go over what we want to say roughly. And they said, well, let's just skip 2 Kings 2. You know, there's you know, not much to it. And I said, okay, that's all right. I said, you know, let me just say one thing about it. And then, of course, I'd go on for like 5 minutes, right? Way too long. But so I don't want to read the whole thing because let me read a little bit and skip around. And then I'll have somebody else read the ending. So, now when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. And Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not lead you." And now this goes on for a while. This scene kind of repeats itself. And we're told repeatedly, Elijah is going to be taken up into heaven. So I think the point there is that Elijah's being taken up into heaven is not the point of the story. Do you remember, I think some of you, you're all about, you know, my age roughly. And so do you remember, what was the Love Story? Was that a movie in the 70s? It had, what's her name? And Ryan O'Neal, Ally McGraw. And you know at the start of the story, right? You're told at the start of the story she dies. Right? So this is not going to be a story about whether she dies. It's going to be about something else. And this is the same way. We're told repeatedly right at the start. So this is not primarily about that. It's going to be about something else. Someone read starting at verse 9, please.
When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?"
let me inherit a double portion of your spirit, Elisha replied. You have asked a difficult thing, Elijah said. Yet, if you see me, and I am taken from you, it will be yours, otherwise not.
Okay, so that's a really interesting thing. So Elisha, who is Elijah's kind of, right, he's his wingman. Isn't that what we think say today? He's the wingman. He says, here's my request, that I would inherit a double share of your spirit. Now that's inheritance language in the Old Testament, right? This is the kind of fun stuff that I get to do. The way inheritance worked in the Old Testament was you picked the number of male heirs, and then you add 1 to that number, and that's the number of shares of the estate. So in my case, right, I have a little brother, so there's two sons, and then you'd add 1, and the older son, which is good, gets a double share of the estate. Huh? Well, yeah, exactly. But that's not what Elisha asks for. You know, he doesn't ask for a double share of the property. He asks for a double share of Elijah's prophetic spirit. Now think back. What do you know from the Elijah story? What was his ministry like? What do you remember?
Rough. He was the warner.
So yeah, it wasn't a picnic being Elijah. He had to hide for years from King Ahab. Then when he finally has his big triumph at Mount Carmel, Queen Jezebel swears she will kill him, so he has to flee for his life all the way back to Mount Sinai. When he's there, God says, "What are you doing here? This is not where you're supposed to be," right? God's pretty hard on him. So I wonder, what is this? May I inherit a double share of your spirit? What do you think? Just sort of in light of what now a little bit you know about what Elijah's spirit was like, and about what Elisha and about how inheritance worked. And then Elijah says, "That's not mine to give. But if you see me while I'm being taken from you, it's granted." Now, the reason I think this story is preserved in the Bible for us for its spiritual power and meaning in our lives, separate from maybe the big overall story that we've just read. So what do you make of that?
He was looking for strength of character and strength of ability. So he must have kind of anticipated a tough time coming.
All right. So yeah, helpful. Others? No wrong answers, just fancy. No, yeah, just go ahead. I don't have an answer I'm looking for, okay? I'm throwing it open for possibility. This is a place where the surplus of meaning of the text takes over.
No matter how many bad things happened to Elijah, he never lost his faith. And I think someone who's struggling in their faith, he sees how strong he is and he wants to become like him. So he's asking, how I see this, he's asking and hoping and praying that he will have as much faith, if not more, in his lifetime that he can share with others.
Nice. Other comments?
Little hero worship, maybe?
Okay, so keep going.
was a tough guy, and he looked up to him and wanted to be like him.
Throw out a few more, just, you know.
Family, want to be in the family that does abortions. Family of God.
So, have there been anybody in your life that you looked up to like that? And I'll just tell you, when my teacher Don Jewell was dying in Princeton, New Jersey, and I was here, I emailed him in his last week and said, I know this is bold, but can I inherit a double share of your spirit? And he never answered. I don't know if he thought I was ridiculous. I don't know if he didn't get the email. But he was that kind of person for me. I mean, if I could have a double share of Don Jewell's spirit, that'd be a pretty good inheritance. How about you? Anybody that you think? Yeah?
My mother.
Yeah? What about her?
I can't talk about without crying.
Yeah, I
You
understand.
know, Very spiritual. Not going there.
Can't talk about it? Okay, that's fair enough.
Okay, we'll go with my Aunt Sharon, she's still living.
Yeah?
And she's a little bossy, a little sassy. You know, and looking at her on the outside, she's just an ordinary person, but she's deeply spiritual and she accepts you as you are, faults and all. She might encourage you to start making better choices, but she won't nag you about it. She'll try to guide you there. And she just kind of gets it. You know, and she's so unselfish, I guess. And she's my godmother.
She's your godmother. Now, I think you could have a rich family Bible study. You know, with some cousins or brothers and sisters who are adults or kids around this story. And share some stories of family and maybe important inheritances. Things, right? I mean, most of us want the thing from mom or dad or grandma and grandpa that's not the valuable thing, but maybe because it means something, right? Like my dad's got this great crucifix. I remember when he got it when I was a little boy. That was up. It's been over every desk he's had as a pastor. Last summer I said, Dad, can I have that crucifix? And he said, your brother already asked for it. I said, that's okay. He should have it. He should have it, you know. But then what happens in the story, of course, is Elijah is taken. Elisha does see it, right? He sees him and he says, Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And then he takes his own piece of clothing and rips it in half. And, okay, remember as I talked about 2 months ago, they only had one piece of clothing. It's not like they could go to Target. But then it talks about how the mantle fell, right? And he picks it up. I can't remember where that happens in here, right? He picked up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and he went back, right? And then he serves. And what is that mantle? You know, that's where this story is where our metaphor of passing the mantle. Did they use that at all when Jim retired? Did anybody talk about passing
Got
the
a
mantle?
baton.
But right, I mean, this story has provided that metaphor. And, you know, what is that mantle that has has fallen to you in your own leadership in life? You know, maybe it was different things, right? I think it could be a rich story. I think I'm going to preach on this story sometime. I've never preached on it, but I highlight it just as we read, sometimes have an eye on the big picture, but sometimes just have wonder about get into it. Just take some time. Ask questions. Because my colleagues this morning said, there's nothing in that story. And because, well, you know, obviously the transfiguration was the key thing, and this is just shedding light. So, well, thanks.